Keats also wrote a poem called Lamia that's about kind of this woman that's also really a snake in disguise. And it's like, again, this seductress, this, mesmerizing kind of woman. Okay, so one of my top 5 favorite poems is Ode to a Nightingale. Um, this is intimidating probably, but once we break it down, maybe it won't be so intimidating. So again, one of the things about Keats's ode is that they have a very sonnet-like feel. They are written in iambic pentameter with some lines of iambic trimeter. And if you look, if you look at the first 14 lines, that actually forms kind of a sonnet, right? There are 8 stanzas of 10 lines. We don't, up to 9 stanzas, we have like special names for them, like couplet and quatrain and all that. 10 lines or more, we don't have a special name for that length of a stanza. Oftentimes, they're broken down into smaller parts. So we might say here's 10 lines that are 2 cinquains, which is, 5, or it might be a sestet and a quartet. This one doesn't really do that. I mean, you can see that in most of it, but it doesn't go through consistency. We're just going to say 10 lines, right? There is internal rhyme. So we have, external rhyme, right? A, B, A, B, C, D, E, C, D, E, F, G, F, G, right? So that actually is a very common kind of sonnet rhyme pattern, right? But we also have internal rhyme. So internal rhyme is where you have things like, so of beech and green. So the E's in beech and green is an example of internal rhyme. And again, when you say it out loud, it just gives this beautiful, rhythmic, sonorous sound, right? In terms of figurative language, we have metaphors. So he calls the nightingale, somewhere up here, a light-winged dryad of the trees. So that's an example of metaphor. We have personification in lines 29 through 30. And so beauty and love are both personified as things. Beauty has eyes and love pines, right? So that's an example of personification. We have alliteration. So an example of that is in line 7. That thou, so that repetition of the sound is alliteration. Simile on line 71. The forlorn, the very word is like a bell to toll me back, right? So like a bell is our simile. Not a whole lot of similes here, but allusion. So an allusion is where you make a reference to an event or a person external to the poem. It could be historical, it could be a literary, So line 16, we have the Blushing Hippocrene. So this is a fountain, I think on Mount Olympus, that has like wine that bubbles over. He also mentions in line 32 Bacchus, who is the Roman god of wine and fertility. The Greek version of that is Dionysus. So we also have, let me see, 36, 64, and 66. So 36, the Queen Moon is on her throne. This is a reference to Queen Mab. If you've read Romeo and Juliet, Mercutio has that very famous speech about Queen Mab and all of her starry phase. So here, the reference to emperor and clown, there's a very famous story about an emperor who loved the sound of the nightingale, but when he saw the bird, I think it was an emperor in Byzantine, he saw the bird, and a nightingale is a very plain bird, right? And so he ordered his court, whatever the dude is that makes stuff, to make him a mechanical bird. And so he made him a nightingale made of gold with jewels all over it, but the sound wasn't good, right? And so the emperor was a fool, right? And then Ruth, this of course is reference to the Bible where Ruth left her family and followed Naomi, right? Oh, whither thou goest, I goest, right? This is one of my favorite lines. The sad heart of Ruth, when sick for home, she stood in tears amid the alien corn. I just love that line. So these are examples of allusion, right? And then throughout, again, one of the distinctions of Keats, more so than any of our other romantics that we've read, is the imagery. Just the incredible visual details that appeal to our 5 senses to make this come alive, right? And if you see over here, On the side, I have the word synesthesia. I ran out of room here for figurative language. Synesthesia is basically using one sense to describe another. So like if you ever heard the term, it's a blue note, like, you know, you hear jazz or something like, oh, he's just playing a blue note. Well, a note is a sound and blue is a sight, right? And so that's synesthesia. And so he is one of the greatest practitioners of it. So synesthesia is lines 11 through 14 is a good example. So here he is saying, oh, for a draught of vintage that hath been cooled a long age in the deep delved earth. So he's asking for wine, and the wine tastes of flora and the country green, dance and Provençal song and the sunburnt mirth. So if you think that it's tasting, but he's describing it in terms of dance, which is a physical, like a movement, right? So that's more of touch. And again, sunburnt mirth, right? So sunburnt would also be something that we feel. And so again, and then we think about the country green, and the flora. These are going to be things that we maybe smell and see. And so this wine is, you know, in that deep delve earth. So this is an example of synesthesia, right? But he also just uses so many senses. So let's look at that. And again, I haven't labeled them all. I'm just going to label. So my heart aches in a drowsy numbness pain. So there's feel, right? This touch, right? I'm numb. And then here is taste, right? We've already talked about that one. And then right here, I cannot see what flowers are at my feet. And then he talks about, you know, he's blind. So there's the idea of sight. And then we have smell, the coming musk rose, and then the murmurous haunt of flies. I actually wrote a short story called The Murmurous Haunt of Flies. It's about a serial killer. The literary exercise was to take a line from a favorite poem and to use it to inspire a short story. So think about the murmurous haunt of flies. So that's appealing to our sense of sound, right? And then again, the birds singing, right, with full-throated ease is another appeal to sound. So if you can go through, you can look at his poems and see how he just layers in. And then compare it to Shelley, compare it to Byron, compare it to Wordsworth, compare it to Coleridge, and none of them are giving us this sensual experience like Keats does, right? Let me see. Themes, the poet versus nature. So again, we saw that with Shelley. In fact, I think when I gave you the Shelley lecture on Ode to a Skylark, I said, you know, compare this to Ode to a Nightingale. There's a lot of similarities to it, except Shelley's is a very cerebral kind of thing, whereas this one is very, very visceral. It's, you know, as much as the poet is leaving his body, he's still very connected to it. Again, we talked about Keats likes to put those conflicting things in opposition. So we see love with death. I'm in love with death. Death is joyful, right? We have illusion versus reality, which is a theme we saw in La Belle Dame sans Merci. We see the poetic imagination, the power of the poetic imagination to visualize this, to think, right? And then beauty as solace, that in all of these things, you know, he's trying, that nature and beauty can give him truth that helps him free himself at least for a little bit of time from the cares that are really weighing him down. We think that he wrote this probably soon after Tom died, and that he had witnessed that, right? So let's look at this. And then you see I have some marks here in the corner. We have a caesura, which again is that pause that you need to fill in for that metrical foot. So the first stanza, he's talking about in these first few stanzas what he wishes that he could do to basically turn his brain off, to find escape from the pain that he is feeling. And so he tries drugs, he tries, you know, something to render himself unconscious. He wants something to drink, right, to, you know, make him, you know, leave all these cares behind. And then what he has is that he finds that the bird, so nature, right, but he can't escape it like the bird does. So for him, hopefully poetry will be a way for him to escape and deal with the pain, right? Yeah, so let's go through this, right? So again, Benedict Cumberbatch, you can just Google Cumberbatch, Cumberbatch, and Ode to a Nightingale. It'll come up. It is amazing, right? So, my heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though of hemlock I had drunk, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains 1 minute past, and Lethe words had sunk. So Lethe is the river that you go through of forgetfulness, right? It makes you forget, right? 'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy in thine happiness, thou light, winged dryad of the trees, in some melodious plot of beech and green, and shadows numberless, singest of summer in full-throated ease. So he's saying, I'm not wishing that I could drink myself into oblivion because I envy you that you're happy and that you have happiness, right? Here I am miserable. So again, he's like, I'm not like some people who just delight in other people's misery and are miserable in other people's happiness, right? He says, I'm too happy, right? Listening to you. And again, he's singing in full-throated ease. And so again, part of this poem is about the difficulty of writing poetry. Oh, if I could only write poetry as easy as the birds sing. So just like Shelley talks about in Ode to a Skylark, Shelley says, if only that skylark could teach me even half so well to sing as well as that, because nature can't be replicated. I can just hopefully come close, right? So he's saying, it's not that I'm envious, right? I'm just a little bit too happy listening to you, right? And so he says, oh, for a draught of vintage that hath been cooled a long age in the deep delved earth, tasting of flora and the country green, dance in the provençal song and sunburnt mirth. So he's describing this nature scene, right? If you've ever seen the movie Much Ado About Nothing with Kenneth Branagh, I think of that scene of them all out dancing and drinking all that when I think about this, right? And he says, oh, for a beaker full of the warm south, full of the true, the blushful Hippocrene, with beaded bubbles winking at the brim, and purple-stained mouth, that I might drink and leave the world unseen, and with thee fade away into the forest dim, right? Fade far away, dissolve, and quite forget what thou amongst the leaves hast never known, the weariness, the fever, and the fret here, where men sit and hear each other groan, where palsy shakes a few sad last gray hairs, where youth grows pale and spectre thin and dies, where but to think is but to be full of sorrow and leaden-eyed despairs, where beauty cannot keep her lustrous eyes, or new love pine at them beyond tomorrow. So if you think about what's going on in his life, he knows that he's going to be dying. I mean, he's getting it himself. His brother is that youth growing pale. Beauty, she cannot remain beautiful. And love isn't going to last, right? He says, I wish that, so this is that negative capability. I wish that I could escape with you into your world, right? Dissolve myself, right? And he says, away, away, for I will fly to thee, not charioted by Bacchus and his pards, but on the viewless wings of poesy, though the dull brain perplexes and retards. So he says, I will, the viewless wings, right? So poesy has invisible wings, right? And though my dull brain, it causes me problems and it slows me down, right? He says, already with thee, tender is the night, and haply the queen moon is on her throne, clustered around by all her starry fays. But here there is no light, save what from heaven is with the breezes blown through verdurous glooms and winding mossy ways. So he's saying, where I'm at, the only light I see is when the wind blows the trees and the moon peeks through, right? He says, I cannot see what flowers are at my feet, nor what soft incense hangs upon the boughs, but in embalmed darkness guess each sweet wherewith which seasonable month endows the grass, the thicket, and the fruit tree wild. So I can smell. I can't see, but I can use my other senses to understand, right? White hawthorn and the pastoral eglantine, fast fading violets covered up in leaves, and mid-May's eldest child, the coming musk rose, full of dewy wine, the murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves. So he's describing not what he can see because it's dark, but what does all his other senses tell him about what this looks like. And he can smell, so he knows what those things are because he can smell them, and he can hear, right? So here's apostrophe. Darkling, I listen. And for many a time I have been half in love with easeful death, called him soft names in many a mused rhyme, to take into the air my quiet breath. Now more than ever seems it rich to die, to cease upon the midnight with no pain, while thou art pouring forth thy soul abroad in such an ecstasy. Still wouldst thou sing, and I have ears in vain, to thy high requiem become a sod. And so here is this contradiction. I'm half in love with easeful death, something that's going to give me peace, right? Life, and again, we're going to see this in Ode to a Grecian Urn repeated. These are very parallel, right? He says, my life is hell right now, right? And it doesn't look like it's going to be any better. And so I've been half in love with this idea of death. And I have kind of tried to court him with my poems, right? And he says, and now he says, the idea of dying with no pain right now, before this tuberculosis puts me in agony, and to do it while I can hear this beautiful song, this ecstasy, right? Ecstasy is oftentimes considered an emotion of pleasure so intense that it's painful, right? And he says, and here's the idea that the bird is immortal. When my ears can no longer hear, I have ears in vain. I'm going to be a sod. I've turned to dirt. You will still be singing this song, right? Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. No hungry generations tread thee down. The voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown. Perhaps the self-same song that found a path through the sad heart of Ruth, when sick for home she stood in tears amid the alien corn. The same that oft times have charmed magic casements, opening on the foam of perilous seas in fairylands forlorn. So now he's pondering, he's using imagination, right? This idea. So here again, we have this idea that's in the Ode to a Skylark. This idea that the bird is more than a regular bird. It exists out of time and place, this song. And I guess, we might think about it in terms that, birds have the same song. One nightingale after another will sing the same song. And so it's almost like the song never ends. Whereas with humans, no poet can write the same, right? We can't continue the song of Shakespeare because Shakespeare was unique. But birds, they have this beautiful song that's replicated, right? So it's like it never dies. And so he's thinking about of all the other times where other people must have heard that, and it connects us, right? So he says forlorn, and then this is this translation, forlorn, the very word is like a bell to toll me back from thee to my soul self. So he can't escape reality. Only death can give him permanent escape. And so this is where, again, he's coming back. He is dissolved. He's got that negative capability, but now he's back into his self, right? Adieu. The fancy cannot cheat so well as she is famed to do, deceiving elf, right? So people are talking about how you can fool yourself, right? But no, it doesn't do it that well. I cannot continue this, right? Adieu, adieu. Thy plaintive anthem fades past the near meadows, over the still stream, up the hillside, and now 'tis buried deep in the next valley glade. So he can hear the bird, as the song gets fainter and fainter, he imagines how the bird is flying away. And he says, was it a vision or a waking dream? Fled is that music. Do I wake or sleep? Right? So at the end, he doesn't even know if this experience was real. Is it his poetic imagination? Right? And Keats would say, and we'll talk about this in the next one, that if your imagination sees it, then it is. Right? So again, a lot of this is how nature, so this bird is the symbol of nature that is taking him away, right? Poetry is his only way of even replicating the bird, and it's not as good, right? But it helps. And then we see this, this juxtaposition of this beautiful sound of the bird that makes him pleasure, gives him pleasure, but it also causes him pain, right? And then the idea of did it really happen? And even if it didn't, does that matter, right? And so I have here at the bottom, again, this experience. You give yourself up to the moment.